As a writer,
Yeah.
so that was quite by accident, a happy accident. I otherwise did my engineering,
Wow.
in electronics and a master's in mathematics from BITS Pilani.
Oh.
I also did an MBA in finance. I was in the regular corporate sector.
Okay.
But right from my childhood, when I was 12 or 13 years old, there was this serial on television called The Sword of Tipu Sultan
Okay.
by Sanjay Khan. Hindu royal family of Mysore, the Wadayars, they were shown in a very, very bad light.
Yes.
The Maharaja was shown like this obese retard who was dancing with the
Yeah.
court dancer. The Maharani was shown as one of the vamps
Yeah.
who was always conspiring against Tipu. So the usual narrative that how to, to elevate one character, you have to show all the other people in a very poor light.
Yes.
So across the state, I come from Bangalore, Karnataka. So across the state where the Wadayar family is still held in a lot of regard and reverence, there were a lot of protests about this.
Yeah.
So, and as a young boy who was just 12 or 13 then, I was really impacted by this, and I wanted to know the truth behind the false portrayal of the Mysore royal family. And so that led to a journey of discovery, self-motivated, self-funded, self-initiated, which lasted almost 10 years, all through the whole, my engineering exams and all of that. And at the end of that 10 years, the interest, expanded not just to that one king and queen, but to the entire dynasty. The Wadayars ruled Mysore, one of the longest reigning royal houses of India, for about 600 years, from 1399 to 1947, but not a single book on them in modern times which covered this entire history. So that is when a lot of people suggested that I should, what all I had gathered in those 10 years of research, I should put it together in the form of a book. And that's how my first book, Splendors of Royal Mysore, the untold story of the Wadayars. It was an untold story that came into being in 2008. And after that, of course, I went on to do a PhD in history and music from the University of Queensland in Australia, and decided to branch out mainstream into being a historian full time. Written some other biographies of Gohar Jan, the first Indian to record her voice on the gramophone in 1902, and also on Veena Vidwan, Dr. S. Balachandar, and these 2-volume biographies of Swatantravir Savarkar, which I've been working on for the last 5 years.
So I would want some director to pick your books and make it into a movie as well.
Yes, the talks are actually on. We want to make.
Really?
Yeah, we've actually at some stage of negotiation about how to adapt it either to a film or an OTT series.
Yeah.
Because that's the way I think the story can reach out to a larger cross section. No, it is so difficult to say that, because it's like asking a parent who's your favorite child. So I think each of those has contributed in its own way. The Mysore book, as I said, was the first book. It was a product of a lot of, it was almost like a family project. My parents, my maternal grandmother, who actually hailed from Hyderabad. So a lot of them were involved in the project. So that is a special book. Gohar Jan got me a lot of accolades, including the Sahitya Academy Award and an award in New York and so on. So that had its own place. And I'm a Carnatic vocalist also, and fortunate to learn under several gurus, Vidwan D.V. Nagaraj in Bangalore, and Srimati Bombay Jayashri, and Dr. Jayanti Kumresh. So Dr. Balachandar was my guru, Jayanti Akka's guru. So it was more of a tribute to my teacher and to the art I've been learning for almost 20-25 years. So each book is very special. And on Savarkar, again, since my mother was a Maharashtrian, a lot of people in my maternal family, they were always talking about Savarkar, but there was so little information about him, which is what inspired me to get attracted to writing his biography. So yeah, it's that whole thing, I mean, in 2003, my first interest in him was peaked in 2003, when the Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government put his portrait in the Central Hall of Parliament, and that led to so much of controversy with the Congress boycotting it. And at the same time, they had also put a memorial plaque in Port Blair, in Kalapani, where he was incarcerated for almost 12 years. And Mr. Ram Naik, the then petrol minister, had put that plaque there. And once the UPA came to power, within a year, you had someone like Mani Shankar Iyer getting that plaque removed and thrown away, and he had a lot of bad things to say about Savarkar. And I think during that time was when this whole calumny against him, these accusations and allegations aided by a lot of historians who were supportive of the government then, these started coming to the fore, that he was an apologist, he was a traitor, he was a collaborator of the British, he was a conspirator of Gandhiji's murder and all of these things. I was seeing all this, and ever since 2014, the manner in which he intrudes contemporary political discourse like very few other politicians or political figures do. Election rallies, there is Rahul Gandhi who is mocking him.
गांधी हमारे हैं, सावरकर आपके। क्या इसमें कोई गलत बात कही मैंने? क्या सावरकर आपके नहीं है क्या? क्या आपने उनको उठा के फेंक दिया? क्योंकि अगर आपने किया तो बहुत अच्छा किया।
Then there is Ranjit Savarkar, his grandnephew, filing a defamation suit against him.
1946 में नेहरू accepted to work in the Viceroy Council as a minister, और तब उन्होंने ब्रिटिश राजा, तब के जब किंग जॉर्ज 6 थे, वो ब्रिटिश राजा भारत का सम्राट कहा है उन्होंने उसे, और उसके वंशजों के प्रति उन्होंने निष्ठा की शपथ ली है। तो ये सब डॉक्यूमेंट्स है आज, तो मुझे लगता है कि ये लोगों के सामने आना चाहिए। ब्रिटिशों की निष्ठा की शपथ सावरकर ने कभी नहीं ली थी।
The Rajasthan government is deciding whether we should have the Veer suffix to his name or remove it. Prime Minister Modi goes to cellular jail and pays his obeisances. All this noise is happening. The BJP wants to know, makes it an election, this thing that they'll give the Bharat Ratna to Savarkar. So constantly he's a part of our contemporary discourse in noisy news debates and everything. But if a young person today wants to know about Savarkar and read about the man and what is all this controversy and noise all about, there is no material. I mean, the last comprehensive biography of his was written in the 1960s when he was still alive by this man called Dhananjay Keer. And he was a acolyte of Savarkar, so a lot of it is very hagiographical account. But then after that, it's taken 70 years for another book on him to actually come out in the public realm, which is very, very sad, because every year you have so many biographies on Gandhi, on Nehru, on so many others, which is how it should be. History should be constantly re-evaluated. But in the case of Savarkar, somehow that re-evaluation was ignored, though he was somebody who is so contemporary, who is so relevant, who is so debated, and who polarizes opinion both for and against him so acutely in India today. All of it. I mean, very few people would actually know that here was a firebrand revolutionary. You know, when revolution, you talk of Kranti, the usual association is with Marxists and communists. But here was the father of Hindutva, who was a firebrand, revolutionary, inspired not by Karl Marx but by the Italian revolutionaries like Mazzini and Garibaldi. He founded India's very first organized secret society called the Mitra Mela, which later became Abhinav Bharat. Someone who organized the first student bonfire of foreign clothes. When you think of boycott of foreign goods, only Gandhiji comes into mind. But in 1905, to protest against the partition of Bengal, Savarkar, who was a student at the Ferguson College in Pune, he organized this bonfire, for which he was rusticated from college as well. And then the 5 years that he was in London as a law student in the India House, they were stormy years, where some of the greatest names in the history of India's freedom struggle, who are sadly never acknowledged, Shyamji Krishna Varma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, then Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, Lala Hardayal, MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer, Sikandar Hayat Khan, all these people were a part of this group with Savarkar, who advocated, mind you, total freedom for the country. At a time when the Congress was still asking for concessions, these people were actually asking for complete liberation. So there was that Savarkar, 12 years of immense suffering, as you rightly pointed out, in the Port Blair, which not even the basic human rights given to a prisoner, that Savarkar who suffered that as well. And then the 13 years he was put in conditional captivity in Ratnagiri, where he heralded social reforms about which also no one talks about. One more plank of the Marxists, either revolutionary or social reform, both of these have been appropriated. But here too, the father of Hindutva actually gave a blueprint as to how these reforms could be implemented, a completely casteless society to ensure consolidation of Hindu society. Intercaste dining, intercaste marriage, the first cafe in India where people of all castes could sit together and eat. In the 1920s and 30s, to think of that when today also it is so difficult. It's quite a far-reaching thing. The first temple in India in 1931 in Ratnagiri where people of all castes could go and pray. Again, at a time when Dr. Ambedkar was leading the Mahad Satyagraha and campaigns like that for temple entry. Here was an actual model which had worked for caste reform with the idea of consolidation of the Hindu society and removing all the social evils that were there in it. So there was that aspect of Savarkar too. And then of course as an active politician, as the president of the All India Hindu Mahasabha, he was probably the only voice which stood for the rights of the Hindus in India at a time when the country was going through a very difficult phase of Muslim separatism, which led eventually to the partition of the country, including in Hyderabad. The role he played in the Bhagyanagar struggle to ensure civil liberties for the Hindus. I think a lot of people in the city also don't know about it. The role that Savarkar played. Many others like Yashwantrao Joshi and others who were in Hyderabad, who actively campaigned, and the Satyagraha lasted for almost 1.5 years with more than 10,000 volunteers suffering the worst of atrocities against them in jails in different parts of Hyderabad state by a very despotic Nizam rule. So that aspect of Savarkar is also there. So each of these are separate chapters in his life: a revolutionary, a social reformer, an active champion of Hindu rights, and also somebody who saw a united India, who opposed partition tooth and nail till the very last moment, till the time partition was a no-brainer, and actually was probably the lone voice which was still advocating an Akhand Bharat, which could not happen actually. Thing I would like to say is I would not like to disparage the role of anybody, including Gandhiji. I think the role of the mass movement, the nationalistic struggle, which gave that sense that a large section of people who wanted to wanted liberation for the country, which Gandhi and the Congress actually spearheaded, that has its own role. So we should not fall into the same trap like the Tipu Sultan serial that I said. To highlight Tipu Sultan, you don't have to show the Wadiyars in a bad light. Similarly, if you want to highlight Savarkar, that doesn't mean you have to put down Gandhi or the Congress. They had their own role, which was very important. At the same time, what has been put down is this parallel, alternative narrative to our freedom struggle, which is important in this Amrit Mahotsav year that we talk about. That right from 1857, when the first war of independence, which is the phrase Savarkar coined after doing research, otherwise it would be called Sepoy Mutiny. From that 1857 till 1946, when we had the naval mutiny, you had the INA, Indian National Army, and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's exploits. There was a continuous and unending stream of armed conflict. So what is perhaps wrong in the way we've been taught our history, especially of the freedom struggle, that Sabarmati ke sant tune kar diya kamal, de di azadi, bina khadag bina bhal, that is not correct. Where along with the non-violent struggle, which was the mainstream movement, there was an undercurrent, a constant undercurrent of armed violence across India, and that was what shook the British Empire. The very fear of a repeat of 1857, when there'll be a revolt in the army, and that's what happened eventually when the INA created revolts in the army. You had the naval mutiny, we still call it naval mutiny, and not the last war of Indian independence, which was what it was, which is what hastened the British to leave the country in a haste and go away, leaving the subcontinent to a mess. So I think that is important, that let us not underplay or disparage or dishonor anybody's contribution, but at the same time, let us not allow suppression of a lot of true voices of the revolutionary movement. When he comes out of Ratnagiri in 1937, so by then this man has actually spent 14 years in actual jail,
Okay.
about 11 years in cellular jail, then 3 years in confinement in Indian jails, and then 13 years in house arrest in Ratnagiri. So totally 14 plus 13, 27 years of bright young man who trained to be a barrister in London, who went there on a scholarship. He was put under imprisonment. So in 1937, when he is finally released from confinement in Ratnagiri and given the opportunity to participate in politics, in fact the Congress party was behind his life saying join us, because they knew that this man was so popular all over India. And so in the book I've mentioned how in a public felicitation function in Bombay and other places, there were messages from Nehru, from Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was then the president of the Congress, from Rajgopalachari and so many others, imploring him to join the Congress. But he's supposed to have said that time that I would rather be in the last row of the patriots than in the first row of the traitors. And according to him, the Congress was steeped in treachery because of their Muslim appeasement. They've gone too far on the path of Muslim appeasement, starting from the Khilafat movement and also their consent to separate electorates, to the communal award, to all of that, and actually tacit support to Jinnah and the creation of Pakistan. There is no point joining them because both of us would be chalk and cheese, and there's no point being with a political party like that. And Gandhi and Savarkar always had this ideological conflict right from the beginning when they met as young men in London at the India House, where their approach to freedom itself, while Gandhi believed in absolute non-violence, Savarkar said that is completely anathema to Indian traditions and Indian culture, where all our gods and goddesses are shown with weapons. These are not just for dikhawa, for ornamentation. If there is adharma, we have been called upon to fight, and even if there is need to be, slay your opponent. As the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna himself says, even if your opponent is your guru or your relative or something, if they are on the path of adharma, you have to kill them, vanquish them. So his constant question to Gandhi was also that do you consider the British Raj as adharma? If it is, then any means to get rid of them is valid. So I think on fundamental points, on Hindu-Muslim unity that the Congress propounded, on this whole caste issue, where Gandhiji was more concerned only on removal of untouchability, whereas Savarkar, Ambedkar, all these people, their views converged on a completely casteless society. And so on all these issues, they never saw eye to eye, and that was one reason I don't think he would have thrived in the Congress if he joined it. Not very different. I think it's the same prototype that was working there. It's a part of the party's DNA, which is how it's manifesting all through.
If you look at the Padma Awards, the difference in the people receiving Padma Awards. Any comments on it?
No, true. I mean, so many unsung, unseen heroes and heroines from all over India. From my state of Karnataka, that lady called Tulsi Gowda, who who came in her tribal attire. Then the person who was an orange seller, who set up a school for children, 100-plus-year-old school teacher in Odisha, and all these people. I don't know how chunke these real gems have been found from India, where hitherto you had to lobby for your award, you had to have some friend in the corridors of power, or you had to be a friend of the government and their ministers to get awards. I think that's a huge democratization, and it's rightly, I think, called People's Padma now.
Correct. So your book mentions Savarkar as a poet, writer and a playwright. Do you have any favorite quote?
Favorite poem I would have, which is his Marathi poem, Ne Majasi Ne Parat Matra Bhumila Sagara Pran Talmalala. He was a very talmalati hui atma, a very restless soul. And so this scene also happens in Brighton in United Kingdom, where he and Niranjan Pal, who is Bipin Chandra Pal's son, they're together on the seashore, and by then the India House has got dismantled and Madan Lal Dhingra has been executed. So they're literally running from pillar to post to save themselves from the British police. And at that time they're at the seashore, they're seeing around a lot of families who are enjoying vacations and holiday and all of that. And at that time, Niranjan Pal writes that Savarkar broke down, and quite extemporaneously he started humming the lines of this poem. And the poem actually is addressed to the ocean, where he admonishes the ocean and says, I trusted you and came all the way here thinking that all this education will help me fight for my motherland. But when my mother back home is in tatters, in rags, what use is this education? How can I enjoy in this happiness with all this luxury when my mother back is in such a bad condition? And he breaks down, composes that poem on the spot. He always took to poetry as a recourse to a lot of the troubles in his life. He lost his mother at a very young age, and that's when poetry also germinated in him. In the cellular jail too, because you mentioned Nehru being given paper to write letters to daughter. Here they were not even given paper and pen or anything. So from either his nails or from the charcoal, like I think Bhadrachal Ramdas used to carve on the walls of of his cell, and 6,000 lines of poems of Kamala, Saptarishi, which are milestones in Marathi poetry. These were written by him while in cellular jail, and to spite him, Barry, who was the jailer, he would come and whitewash all of this. But little did he know that this man had such a precocious memory that he would memorize all these poems and come out and get those published. Similarly, when he jumps the ship in Marseille in France, he's caught and brought back to the ship. And at that time, the British soldiers who are there, they beat him up and all of that. And then, as a defiance, he composes this poem, Anadi Mi, Ananta Mi, which is again he said, you may capture my body, but my soul is Anadi. It is Anant. So these are all very, very milestone, poems in Marathi literature, which he has composed. So, I say it repeatedly that forget his whole political ideology and contribution to politics and freedom struggle. Just on the worth of the, literary output that the man did. That itself is enough for him to win several awards and to be feted as a great literature. The kind of work he did for Bhasha Shuddhi in Marathi. Marathi, lot of the words, Doordarshan, Digdarshak, these words were created by him to actually. So one Shabdakosh was created so that you have the vocabulary, you have the words which you can then use in modern language without that just saying we want our mother tongue, but if a child actually needs to study chemistry or physics in Telugu or Kannada or Marathi, you should have the words which are there, which should be created. So his role there in language reform to purge it of all the external influence, the amount of corruption that had come into Marathi with Persian and Urdu and all these words, all of those was removed and it was made into a modern scientific language. A lot of the things that the current government does, they may not directly give credit to Savarkar, but then a lot of it is, I think, inspired by his ideology. That, even his book that he wrote when he was in London was called शत्रुंचा शिबिरात in Marathi, शत्रु के शिविर में जाके तो दुश्मन के घर में घुस के उनको मारना है. So we've seen that with Balakot and all of that happened. Savarkar was among the few people who advocated and supported the creation of Israel in 1948 when most of India took a very ambivalent stand. Today under Prime Minister Modi we've had probably for the first time a deepening of bonds between Israel and India, which are natural allies according to me, considering the convergence of views on several issues, anti-terror and on technology, on agriculture, on startups, and so many things like that. So his views on foreign policy, national security, all of that is something that I think the current government is implementing. Things like abolition of triple talaq and so on, which someone like Savarkar always stressed that in his conception of a Hindu Rashtra, it was not that any one particular community gets extra concessions or privileges, not even the Hindus, only because they are majority, and a minority will not get concessions only because they are less in number. Everybody is going to be equal in the eyes of the law. So sabka saath, sabka Vikas. So what else is that everybody is treated in an equal manner, and everybody has the opportunity in this country to be equal citizens and make use of the opportunities to thrive. So many of these concepts, as I said, they may not be attributed to him, but I think the inspiration one can draw back to him. After centuries of invasions and attacks and so on, we've got so deracinated. The best form of subjugating a group is cultural subjugation, where we've been made to feel so apologetic about our past. We've been made to feel that nothing about our civilization is something we have to be genuinely proud of. There's a thin line between jingoism and beating your chest and all of that, and actual fact-based pride about what you do, about your past and what you've achieved as a civilization. So this civilizational awareness is something that was subjugated all the time. We have always been shown that we are a civilization that lost. We are losers, from the Arabs to the Turks to the Mongols to the Dutch to the French to British to everybody just kept coming to this Sone Ki Chidiya, and we were just helplessly sitting there and getting attacked. And so that's why the British created all these myths, including the Aryan invasion theory and all of that, to justify you don't deserve to be ruled by yourself. From your very first set of people, everyone has come from outside. They have given you culture. You as an indigenous community, you don't have no culture or knowledge or anything. And we've somewhere imbibed those subconsciously, I think, and including educated Indians, educated Hindus. So this decolonization that we need to do to come out of this colonized mindset and stand up on our feet. It will take time, 1,000+ years of slavery, of breaking someone's spine. It will not happen overnight. That it will take time, but I'm very happy. I'm optimistic about the future because I see the consciousness now growing increasingly among people who are not necessarily affiliated to any party or any ideological group or anything. Common Hindus, common Indians. When this recent dismantling global Hindutva conference happened, the government or the RSS and all these people kept curiously silent. The entire campaign and the outrage was spearheaded by common Hindus, whether it was in America or in India. I think that is that new consciousness which is so important and so precious, and to give that momentum, to ensure that goes. So today, including, if there is a Diwali ad campaign, etc., which someone does, if it goes against Hindu interests, 30 years before we would have taken it lying down. 30 years back, in popular media, in cinema, in television, a Hindu will always be shown in a villainous way. A Brahmin priest is always the most cunning and despotic fellow. So all that would go away unnoticed by several of us. Today people are standing up and saying, thus far and no further. We will boycott you, we will economically, you will have to pay the price for it. And that consciousness, it is not, it is a very non-violent, it's a very, but an assertive kind of a consciousness which is coming. It will take time, but I think the momentum is there, and we should fuel that momentum to ensure that no one can suppress us anymore. And particularly through the education system, having that pride and confidence in your own civilization, I think that is very important. Need for that unalloyed patriotism, unalloyed love for the country, and great courage to get to that. I think these are traits which we need to imbibe. At the same time, someone who's sensitive, a revolutionary who is a sensitive poet. So the man of multiple contradictions that he was, but that blending of visibly our contradictions, that's what India is. This blending of diversities into one united force. So I think that's a beautiful question that we need to imbibe the Savarkarite spirit in a lot of us, and that's one way we can, to your earlier question about how we can stand back on our feet as a civilization, that's the only way one can do that. We do come from two Indias where we keep saying that terror has no religion, but then gang rape certainly seems to have one religion. Caste also has patriarchy also has a caste. So there are two Indias, there are a lot of hypocrisies. But this again ties into what I said earlier, that 20 years ago we would have laughed along with this You had the Jaane Bhi Do Yaro and all those films where the Draupadi and the whole Mahabharata was made a spoof of. Sometimes it's nice to also loosen up and laugh. At ourselves, we take ourselves too seriously all the time. I think it's good to have a sense of humor, but there is a line that needs to be drawn, and also to be seen the differential standards. Can a similar joke be cracked on some other religion in India, and what would happen? We've seen what happened to Kamlesh Tiwari. We've seen what's happened to so many people. So if there is freedom of expression and this ability to laugh at ourselves, let it be equally applied to everyone, and let us all laugh as a nation at all the contradictions and stupidities that all of us have in our faiths. But then to just target and make only one community the butt of jokes, I think that is wrong. But